Well, good afternoon. Welcome back to this penultimate session of Government 2025, the Institute for Government's annual conference, which we're holding in partnership with Grant Thornton UK. My name is Akash Paun. I'm Programme Director for Devolution here at the IFG, and really pleased to be hosting this discussion of the devolution revolution, what next for England's mayors. And it's a great pleasure to be joined by two of the growing cohort of England's mayors. To my left, Ben Houchen, who's been mayor of the Tees Valley since the post was created in 2017, re-elected twice since then, and the only remaining Conservative Metro mayor. So Ben, thanks a lot for joining us.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.
And then to my right, welcome to Claire Ward, who was elected to the new post of Mayor of the East Midlands, created across Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire last May. And great to have you with us, Claire.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we've got 45 minutes or so for this session. We're going to be discussing, I think, primarily what the Labour government has committed to in terms of its plans for taking forward the devolution process across England, as set out in some detail in the white paper published just before Christmas, Power and Partnership, it was called. And I mean, here at the IFG, I think we were pleased to see quite a lot of the proposals in the white paper, lots of things we favour, including the firm commitment from ministers to complete the map of English devolution, as they put it, to extend the devolved model to the whole of the English population, but also to deepen the powers of existing mayors, including through funding reform, the integrated settlement model I know we'll be talking to you about shortly, and lots of other reforms besides, including putting devolution on a firmer footing, reforming scrutiny and accountability, and much more. And then I think we also welcomed at a kind of higher level the fact that Labour, unlike too many of its predecessor governments as incoming administrations, really have opted to build on the foundations put in place by the previous government. And yes, with some interesting differences and departures, but they certainly haven't sort of scrapped the existing structures in the way I think, for example, we saw in 2010 and maybe in some previous governments as well. So that's the government that was led in terms of the devolution portfolio by Michael Gove in the latter years, of course, as Levelling Up Secretary. Michael Gove was unable to join us here today, but instead he was kind enough to pre-record an interview with us to set the scene for this discussion. So before I turn to the two speakers on stage with me for conversation, this is what Mr. Gove told us.
It's difficult to decide what a perfect system of local government and a perfect system of devolution within England would look like. But I do think, to be fair, this government is moving in a direction of which I approve in this area. So expanding both the powers of existing metro mayors and making sure that more of the country benefits from the mayoral combined authority model. The one area of difference that I have, I think, with the government is that I'm not convinced that it's necessarily right everywhere in the UK. It's in the nature of English local government that we've never really had perfect uniformity, and perfect uniformity may not be the ideal end goal, but overall, moving towards unitarisation and then having mayoral combined authorities, I think provides the right mix of accountability, but also the exercise of power at an appropriate level in order to get big things done. I think that the ideal is to move towards a situation where metro mayors have more extensive planning powers, and that seems to be very much in the pipeline, but also critically, they have a greater degree of autonomy over tax and spend. It's very difficult in this country for reasons that Ed Balls and researchers at King's have pointed out, because of the way in which over time, for entirely understandable reasons, taxation has been centralised. And there is a fundamental challenge here, and the challenge is between autonomy and equity. So in an ideal world, one would want to give the metro mayors far greater control over taxation, and indeed local government overall far greater control over taxation. But because of some of the entrenched inequalities in our country, which of course the mayors are doing a great deal to address, we nevertheless require a transfer of resources that means that the ideal level of autonomy that one would want to have at local level is difficult to deliver, certainly over the short term. There are a number of challenges that one automatically faces if you're arguing in favour of devolution. Some of them are institutional, some of them are political. So there are some government departments that, irrespective of who heads them, have a sort of character. I wouldn't want to overstate it, but they have a character which tends to be centralising. So DWP and the Treasury in particular seek to administer across the United Kingdom in a way which, and again, they're driven by reasons of equity and efficiency as they see it. They do not like inconsistency. They do not like the notion that, for example, a different approach towards welfare might be taken in Greater Manchester, or that their overall control of tax should be subverted, and certainly of borrowing, should be subverted by what happens at a local level. So institutionally, they're opposed. There have been some challenges both in Cambridge. There are some specific challenges there because of the range of different bodies that have a stake in Cambridge's growth and because of Cambridge's importance to the nation's economy. And there have also been some issues in the west of England, in the Greater Bristol area as well. But I don't think these are insuperable, or I don't think it's impossible to overcome them. But again, I would say that there are some parts of the country where the mayoral model may not work, but I think the key thing to do is to make sure that in those areas where it's been established, hard work is undertaken in order to ensure that the functions of the mayor are clear, the relationship with other authorities is clear, and the mayor can get on and deliver. And those local authority areas that may want to hang back, I hope we'll be able to see the benefits of that model in the future, so that they want to get on board rather than hang back. One thing I should say is that I'm hopeful that we will see in Norfolk and Suffolk the sort of progress that we were driving in the past. I think the government paused there, but I don't think it was because they're necessarily hostile to the idea. I think they just wanted to make sure that Jim McMahon and others could get an approach that they believed was coherent and unified. So from my point of view, the jury will be out, but I'm not critical at this stage. The most important thing is I can understand why people want to talk about revolutions, but the most important thing is just to concentrate on the detail, concentrate on an effective partnership with mayors, and do as we did with Andy Burnham, to say, with greater power comes greater accountability. This was the argument that he always made. This is the argument that Andy Street always made. What they want is a light shone on their performance. These are big guys who are confident in their ability to deliver, and they welcome scrutiny. So that's the critical thing. Make sure that as you hand over these powers, and that they're the right mix, which will actually ensure that there is change on the ground, also make sure that there is an appropriate method of scrutiny and accountability there to help revive democracy at a local level.
Okay, great. So there's a number of themes in that I'm sure we'll touch upon in the conversation that follows. Just to say before we get stuck in, there will be time for audience Q&A, obviously both the people in the room and anyone watching online. If you want to submit questions, you can do so via Slido, and we'll come to that. I'd like to bring in our two speakers now. So Ben, starting with you, what's your assessment of the Labour government's approach, its white paper? Is it offering the right package of powers? What's missing?
Yeah, I think broadly, it's never enough. As a mayor, you always want more control, more powers, more money, etc., which is the nature of the role compared to central government. So, is it the end goal? No, it's not. But I think one of the things I realised a number of years ago, and I think this is the way that central government interprets it, is it's very much kind of an evolving journey. And one of the things that I was told a long time ago, which seems to have borne fruit, is that there's this idea of earned autonomy as well. So they'll give you a little bit of power and a little bit of money, see how you get on with that, let that bed in, and then give a little bit more and a little bit more. So we've got to remember we're, 15, 16, 17 years behind London. And it's taken London a long time to mature, and it's still got things to improve, not necessarily because of the politics, but because of the structures. I don't see combined authorities being any different to that. So we'd like to move faster, and I think there should be a mechanism to allow areas to move faster where they've been able to demonstrate competence. I think in reality, the positive thing I would say is that this white paper, if it follows through into legislation, is probably the most significant development in devolution since English devolution was established under George Osborne. I mean, we had lots of false starts. You know, Theresa May wasn't, certainly from my experience, wasn't particularly enamoured with devolution. Obviously, it came back a bit with Boris, and then Rishi was again not against it, but relatively lukewarm. Whereas this feels like a genuine step forward for devolution, particularly around single pot planning. Those are the two areas where I think it can make a significant difference. But beyond that, there's still a lot more to do around, as Michael said, and all the mayors keep saying, around fiscal devolution, taxation, autonomy, etc., and simplification of decision making as well.
Yes, themes we would definitely come back to. Claire, what's your take? I mean, is this, the government likes to use the phrase devolution, revolution, I think, because it almost rhymes, but do you think this amounts to a revolution if the white paper were to be implemented? What's your assessment of it?
I certainly think it's a significant step forward from where we are, and I broadly agree with what Ben says around the fact that, you know, where we are, the starting point to where the white paper sets out it wants this country to be is a significant move. But I do think there is so much more that can come out of it. So not just the things that Ben's already outlined, but the opportunities in terms of public sector reform, the opportunities for mayors to be involved in and joining up health and welfare. Particularly, we saw in the white paper the suggestion that mayors might lead around their local health boards. And I think that's a really significant step forward that will allow us all to do things at a different speed, but actually to learn from each other. And I think that's one of the kind of key principles for me, which is we've seen the way in which Greater Manchester and West Midlands have moved over the last few years and the developments that they have had. From my perspective as a new mayor in a new authority, we will move much faster because we will learn from them. We will take advantage of these new powers. And what might have taken Andy, either of the Andys, 8 years or so to develop will hopefully be much quicker, the speed of that development for us, because we will learn from that. And because many of the civil servants, many of the public officers who have worked in those are now moving across combined authorities and bringing with them that level of expertise. And every single one of us is learning and moving and improving as we go. So, you know, sometimes I describe this as a little bit like that time when most of us went from telephones with a landline through to mobiles. In some parts of the world, they skipped the bit with wires and when they went straight to mobiles. I think that's a bit of our revolution that's going to take place here.
Yeah, really useful opening thoughts there. I mean, in terms of, you started talking about the breadth of powers, I suppose, as well as the depth. Like, I'm quite interested in how broad you would like to go, because, you know, the focus of devolution really since 2014, when as Ben mentioned, this was kicked off by George Osborne, has principally been about growth, economic levers, transport skills, housing, and so on. There's a bit of talk in the white paper about going beyond that into public service functions like health, justice, employment support as well. I mean, how far would you want to get into public service delivery? Is that really the next phase of this, or should the focus be more on growth and jobs and investment?
I think growth, jobs, absolutely. That's the forefront of what we do. But we also recognise that sometimes in order to achieve that growth, you need to work better across the public sector. And I think that the white paper sets out those opportunities to do that. So I would see us being able to utilise the connections and the influence, as well as the powers that we have, those convening powers too, to bring together different aspects of what makes it right within our regions. What can we do? There's no point in providing skills and jobs to people if actually they haven't got the health or the other opportunities to be able to access them. So working with the health sector, working with DWP to connect all of those things to really open up the opportunities seems to me to be a no-brainer.
What's your take on that, Ben? Because obviously you've been in post a while, and I mean you haven't taken on some of those functions that some of the other mayors have got involved with, health, for example, justice functions as well. Is that what you're now looking to do as well? Or I know you have often spoken in maybe a more focused way about the role of mayor as being about growth and jobs, basically.
Well, I think what we're seeing from the white paper is there's going to be more of a one-size-fits-all. So there's going to be more uniformity. So it may be not up to me what I get responsibility for, but we'll see. I mean, I take a slightly different view from most of my other mayoral colleagues, because I think this is not a point of specific powers, it's a point of principle on what combined authorities are there to do, but also particularly around how government functions and works in the public sector more generally. And I think one of the reasons combined authorities and mayors have been so successful is because our remit is very narrow and it is very focused around, in effect, being politically accountable RDAs. So it's very kind of economic growth, jobs, investment focused. And my worry is where we see the sprawl over many decades in local government, where more responsibility and more statutory requirements are put on local authorities, and actually you have a very big burgeoning organisation that spreads itself quite thinly but doesn't do anything particularly well. And I think having that razor focus and having a set of powers that are very narrow are one of the reasons why we're quite lean and very focused in being able to deliver a lot of those things. And I've always, and I've lobbied this government, I lobbied the previous government, my view would have been to give us more powers and deeper powers already what we have control over, rather than trying to broaden the spectrum. Because invariably, somebody can always make the argument that we need more power. So, I mean, I get the health argument. You say, well, you're going to create jobs. There are people further away from the jobs market. If more people are in work, that's good for the economy, so we need to help people with health. But then if you get onto health, then you need to get into social care. And if you get into social care, and it's like, where does it stop? And all of a sudden, you're 10 years down the line, and you're a bit of a behemoth. And if you're not careful, actually, what you become are supra local authorities, which, potentially with local government reorganisation could see that happening anyway at some point in the future. So I just think public bodies and government bodies can be very effective when they're ultra narrow, ultra specific, and have a very clear remit rather than doing too much. But that's just my view.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've heard you speak in those terms before, and as you say, your focus would be to get, I suppose, fuller, complete control over defined, devolved functions. Do you think the white paper takes you towards that in terms of, I think, for you, skills, transport, housing regeneration? Those are the key things.
A little
Have you
bit,
got what you want in those areas?
A little bit. The planning stuff's interesting.
Right.
That could be helpful if it was developed and pushed even further. Again, I was pushing more, actually, if the government wanted to achieve its goals, then I actually was saying they should just give mayors powers rather than combined authorities, and specifically in relation to planning, take it away from the councils and give it to mayors. So not just at a strategic level, invest the planning powers in a mayor.
Yeah.
You've got directly elected mayors, you want some responsibility.
As in London.
As in London. So I think I wanted to push much further on that side of things, and there's been a bit of a compromise. So, I think that's it's a step in the right direction, right? I mean, things around sills, for instance, that we didn't have access to and availability to as mayoral deals would be quite
Community
helpful.
infrastructure levies.
Yeah, apologies, community infrastructure levies, particularly when you pair that with the spatial plans that, in effect, or the SDSs we're having to put in place. But again, a lot of that is quite medium term, because by the time the legislation passes, and I was asking you because we keep asking when the legislation is going to pass, that's a period of time. Then you've got to have the capacity to build up on the planning side, to put the evidence together. Then you've got to put an SDS together. So you're 2 or 3 years down the line before you've even really started to signify, the Parliament's gone, right? And I just think there are some things that could be in there that would get them to where the government actually want to get to around growth much more quickly. But it would have required actually some quite tough decisions around what does local democracy actually look like going forward, which I don't think the government have really wanted to combat beyond a level of local government reorganisation.
On the devolution bill, I mean, how big of a deal do you think that is going to be? I mean, I think the government has made quite a big deal of putting the devolution framework into statute for the first time, creating this tier of government in a more consistent way across the country. I mean, do you think that having that legislation is going to be a game changer?
I think so. I think it sets out a really clear direction and commitment to devolution and to why we want to see devolution and what impact it will make within those communities. I think by having a framework, by setting the goals about how you achieve that, I think is really important, and the integrated settlement will be a key part. Obviously, I know I don't speak for Ben, but I think we are probably of shared view around wanting access to that integrated settlement as early as possible. And certainly I make the case for the East Midlands. When we are building a framework and a structure now with all of the levels of accountability, it's much easier to do that, knowing that we're going straight into an integrated settlement within a medium, short to medium term, rather than to build for one type of accountability, only to have to change that. That's costly, it's bureaucratic. I'd much rather see a focus upon accountability frameworks, the transparency, the scrutiny, rather than an arbitrary 18 months lead-in time. Why is there 18 months? What's that impact? So I'd like to see some aspect of that, but obviously that particular bit, for me, is not something I want baked in right now.
Yeah.
The cynic in me would suggest, sorry to interrupt,
no, it's okay.
And we were talking about this internally before the detail was put out, that the government aren't going to want to deal with all combined authorities at once. And it almost feels to me, personally, as a mechanism to deal with maybe 3, 4 or 5, to get them through, manage it, and then go for a second cohort. And they've kind of come up with a relatively arbitrary process to have kind of phasing of it.
Yeah, so I mean, for people who may not be across all the detail of this relatively technical but very important subject. So, I mean, what the white paper sets out is Greater Manchester and the West Midlands will, from this April, be given a single integrated settlement with, we don't know the exact figure, but I think sort of 600-700 million odd per year, something like that, but with a lot more flexibility to reallocate funding across transport, skills, housing, local growth, employment support eventually, and a couple of other things. Next year, we expect maybe 5 more places, Liverpool, West and South Yorkshire, North East, and is that it? One other.
Which is also interesting.
To get it. But your 2 regions are being left out for now. So how are you making the case?
If you also look at the North East, for instance,
yeah.
North East is doing some interesting things. It's not about the North East, but they were North at the time.
Yeah.
They've in effect constituted a new combined authority, which takes time to get up and running. But they've treated them differently as well. So it definitely feels to me like the government just want a small handful of tranches. And, it's look at the draw, really, whether you're, to be fair, Manchester and Birmingham, West Midlands, were always ahead because they had the Trailblazer deals. But it feels to me like the future tranches are a bit of kind of look of the draw as to whether you made it or not.
Yeah.
Because there's no reason why Clare and East Mids, with the organisation they've got, couldn't be part of tranche 1. Absolutely not, and vice versa, right? We could do exactly that. We've been around for years and could do it. But it's just that management of, the civil service wanting to deal with a number of things rather than having to blanket change everything all in one year.
Yeah, I think what I would say is
for other aspects, because ultimately, if you're looking at growth and you're looking at projects, you want to be able to give confidence, and that stop-start on funding doesn't give the same level of confidence, whereas that integrated settlement would give us more flexibility, and I think that would help us move much faster. So I think there is a focus for us back on the accountability and the governance.
Yeah, I mean, IFG's been very favourable towards the integrated settlement model. I think what we have picked up, though, I mean, even with Greater Manchester, which is, the longest established, the biggest, I think, CA by some distance, it's been quite a big project for them to just set up the capacity they need, the kind of strategic finance capacity, essentially to create their own mini treasury, to think strategically across the piece about resource allocation over a 3-year period or whatever. That's quite a big job.
I don't think it's that difficult.
So not to say that. Well, I mean, I think.
I also think it does a disservice
to the
regions.
Of people in the
absolutely. I think
authority.
people do. The regions a disservice by suggesting that the capacity could not be recruited and to some extent isn't already there. Okay, not necessarily every single bum on seat, but I don't think it's beyond the wit of man to be able to put these things in place over the next 18 months where we could all do that. And the idea that we're any further behind, okay, Greater Manchester's a bit of an exception, right? But, the North East, for instance, or Cambridge and Peterborough, or whatever it might be, makes no sense, right? Because they're not any further forward, but yet they're in the next tranche. So again, it is what it is. It's a problem because the integrated settlement, as Claire rightly says, is about certainty.
So what did the Treasury say when you make this case that you're ready to take that on now? What's the...
So these are the rules that have now been established and adopted, so it is what it is. I mean,
I don't know, I don't speak for you, Ben, but ultimately I will still keep pushing on that door.
And you are very much.
Very much so, because I really think it's important that we were able to save some of that time. And it isn't just about that level of capacity, it's about building for two separate systems, which is what we're currently doing. Why would we waste that time? Why would we waste that resource in doing it?
So the session after this, of course, is with the Chief Secretary. Don't know if you're sticking around to heckle from the audience, but feel free to do so.
I think they're getting the message.
I'm not sure if he's observing this exchange at the moment. So keen to come to questions soon. Moving quickly on to a couple of, related things, actually. I mean, I think you've both already talked about scrutiny, accountability. In a way, this is an obvious point, but certainly one the government has made, and we would echo. As mayors become more empowered and are given that greater flexibility, rather than being tied to specific departmental, ring fences and the like, clearly it becomes more important that you have appropriate accountability and scrutiny systems. Do you agree that those, let's start with you, Ben, do you agree that those need to be strengthened, and what would a better system of scrutiny and accountability look like?
I think what's being proposed is pretty sensible, whether it's around regional committees or even through, parliamentary committee structure. Pretty relaxed about it. We've got mayoral question time being introduced. I mean, a reflection largely of what they have in London. Things can always improve, but seem to make sense.
An elected Tees Valley Assembly.
But again, I actually think, again, slightly differently. I'd go the other way, and I think actually we should be having more of a London model, which is the executive should be invested in the mayor. At the minute, actually, for those that may not be aware, there are very few decisions in reality that a mayor can make without garnering the support of the majority of the local authority leaders within their combined authority area. And I think you can make much more progress. And again, if you're going to have a directly elected mayor, and we're going to be the ones sat in front of those committees or in the question times, or we're the ones going to be asked by the journalist about why did you do that and why did that go wrong, nobody ever asks a local authority leader who was part of that decision-making process. So it's kind of like, well, if you're going to give us the responsibility and the scrutiny, which I'm more than happy for, let me take it on my shoulders and be the one that actually made the decision by myself and say, okay, yeah, that was my decision and this is why I made it and I'm happy to be accountable for it. Absolutely, the scrutiny element is an important part of it.
Claire?
I don't disagree with the idea of taking on more accountability and more scrutiny, but obviously I want that with the powers that I can deploy in that sense. So I think the way in which we are working, certainly in the 9 months or so that I've been in post, is to try to create as much consensus as possible across those. But I would open up to even more, whether or not we sort of think about a regional public accounts committee or a different kind of structure that would allow us to be held more accountable. But I've got some sympathy with the point that Ben makes, that ultimately it's us that's up for direct election when you're a mayor, and therefore you will be held accountable.
So if you think, just very quickly, if you think about it, if we move towards integrated settlements, and if those processes are in place, and we've talked about this collectively as mayors with the government and in particular the Treasury, why do we need to go through departments? In effect, we then become pseudo departments in our own right. And so we should have, which we already do actually through our assurance frameworks, direct relationship with the Treasury. And so at spending reviews or budgets, we should be submitting, in effect, our own submissions to that spending review as regional authorities, rather than having to do this weird dance with different departments.
That's the idea of the integrated settlement model, that you just have a single settlement with the Treasury.
The difficulty, I think, in reality, the scrutiny and the process stuff will figure its way out, and there'll be a level that gets to that people are comfortable with. The difficulty that I understand Treasury are having to deal with, and other departments, is the accountable officer point. Because even if we do that, you've still got an officer in the Department of Transport, Department of Education, that is the accountable officer signing that off. And if they can figure out a way of unpicking that, that's where you can really unleash I think, what would be the next phase of devolution, which gets us to that integrated settlement, direct relationship with Treasury, and making sure then you've got the accountable officer that will probably end up sitting in the combined authority rather than each department.
No, agreed on that point. I mean, just finally, Claire, on the the role and personal powers, if you like, of the mayor. So, I mean, the white paper, again, we were pleased to see this as we suggested previously, suggested or has proposed basically a default decision-making rule that based on majority decisions on the Combined Authority Board. So for things like spatial plans, budgets, transport strategies, no more will there be a requirement for unanimity or supermajorities and all these things that make it hard to get things through. Ben, I think, is making the case that really the mayor should have almost unilateral power over some of those things. Where do you sit on that?
So I welcome the majority voting, the simple majority. I think it makes it much easier. This might be the staging post, and I think it goes back to what we started with at the very beginning, which is you build the confidence, you build the structure, and you may well get to that point later on. But I think right now it's a good place to be.
Yeah, okay, great. Cool. So
we already have that.
Go on then, Ben. Sorry, what do you have?
So we already have majority voting. And a lot of the first wave.
Things.
Well, in everything except for the budget.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't be on spatial plan.
Well, that hasn't come in yet, but the idea is that
places,
they're making it uniform for decision-making
sure,
of everyday decisions. That doesn't actually affect us at the minute.
Fine.
We're not being taken
But
for.
mayors that have planning functions at the moment, the default there is it's by unanimity, which is why Andy Burnham couldn't get his one. We were talking about this.
Yeah.
So, yeah, okay. So it won't be a huge change for you in terms of how it works at the moment. Understood. Okay, let's get some questions from the audience. So someone mentioned local public accounts committees. So Ed Hammond stuck his hand right up, I imagine. And before you go, yeah, so we'll take 3 questions. If a couple other people want to stick their hands up, please do so. So yeah, we'll come to these 2 as well. Ed.
Thanks, Akash. Ed Hammond from the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. I'm not actually going to ask about LPACs because I think that would be too much of a cliche if I did that.
Sorry, Ed.
What I'm going to ask is a more general question about the mindset around governance in CAs. And CA governance is quite local government-y. It's sort of it's built on that sort of model. And I wondered if, now that CAs are maturing, in your view, governance and accountability and the mindset and attitude that people acting in that space are bringing needs to move away from that local government feel to reflect more closely what it is that CAs are actually doing and proposing to do in the future, particularly in light of the integrated settlement, and whether you see governance moving and looking really quite different in future for CAs.
Thanks, Ed. Great. Okay. The lady just here, yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth Shovelton, Department for Transport. I'd be really interested to know what central government departments can do to work most effectively with the mayors in future. Are there particular things you would find most helpful, and if so, why?
Great question. Thank you very much. And yeah, 3rd one here.
Thank you. Hi, Fabian Chessel from Policy and Practice. Actually, building on that question, so we work with local authorities and are trying to get data out of central government into the local authorities. And to your point about them taking the time, we're often told, well, 2 years maybe, for the first wave maybe. And so I'm quite curious, from your side, where else are you finding things take longer than they should, or there are these non-financial impediments put in your way for delivery that you would really like central government to help remove some of those impediments?
Okay, thanks. 3 good questions there. Who'd like to go first on any or all of those?
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, as somebody not really with a local government background, and I think more and more of the mayors actually don't have that local government background, I'm certainly arriving at this and having to remind officers and others, don't talk to me about some local authority because I have no idea who or what you're talking about. This is relatively new, and so I'm approaching it in a different way. I'm approaching it perhaps with my health service, NHS. I was chair of an NHS trust view of things, or maybe with my parliamentary previous experience, or maybe with my business experience. And I think that's important because actually these are not local government. It is not a council, and I have to explain that sometimes to people. We are a strategic body. We're a combined authority because we are there to make strategic decisions that often will have implications and under greater understanding, perhaps within a commercial world or a business community than they are within a local government. So I think that culture change is actually important, and I think it is beginning to happen a little bit, and that might be by the nature of the people who are coming into it. On the second thing, what can central government departments do? Come and see us. Come and see what it is actually like in some of those regions. And I say that particularly as Mayor of the East Midlands. We sometimes, we feel, I have done for many, many years, a bit like a flyover or a drive-through or a train-through region. When people come out of London, and I say that as a former MP in Watford, so not too far away from here, but having lived in the East Midlands for well over a decade, when people do come out of London, they tend to think we're going north, and they might head towards Ben, and they might head towards Manchester, and if they do think about the Midlands, they'll go to Birmingham. And I think you really do have to understand the differences, particularly for a region like mine, which is not that urban or city pull towards it. Its significant part of it are rural, small towns, communities, particularly ex-mining communities, as well as 2 relatively small cities. And the culture around all of that and the way in which you deliver services is very different. And that's what we need, the mindset for government departments and civil servants. Please come and see how we are doing, what those challenges are that we're faced with. The final one, non-financial impediments, probably very much that, actually, which is I think sometimes a culture of thinking that it works in a model like Manchester, or it works in a model like Birmingham. And that's a real challenge. So apart from the arbitrary rules, the integrated settlement and things like that, I think people need to understand how difficult it is to get to the cities and to access skills if you live in a community of 10,000, which is 45, 50 minutes away with very little public transport. And we're also an area that doesn't have an existing public transport authority. So I think that understanding different regions and the challenges that they face is actually why we want devolution, because we want to be able to fit the solutions to the challenges that we have.
Thanks. Ben?
Just very quick, I agree with pretty much everything Claire said, but just to add on the Ed, we've talked about this briefly a few times, and it's very local authority, and there's a culture and a mindset with how local authorities engage with combined authorities, which as combined authorities continue to grow, and particularly favoured by now governments of both colours, which I think is very helpful from a consistency point of view, needs to be elevated. If we can get integrated settlements, if we can deal with the accountable officer issue within departments, then actually we should be dealt with in the same way as a department. We should be accountable to the appropriate select committee, whether that's MHCLG, we should be accountable to the Public Accounts Committee. Once you get to that stage of maturity, that's absolutely the accountability that should be had. And a lot of us are saying, well, let's get there sooner rather than later. So I do think that's ultimately where it will end up. Will that be in 2, 3, 5 or 10 years' time? Above my pay grade, but I think that's where I think we'll end up. I personally think, because even with regional public accounts committees, if you end up with a direct relationship with Treasury as part of a spending review that's, fundamentally impacting, even if it's just economic growth, so many different things, it feels odd for that to be slightly detached from central government and Parliament. So that there's a nice, I think, cohesion to that you've got devolution, but the Centre and Treasury ultimately still have oversight, which again goes back to the democratic point. I think, on department work, it's a two-way conversation, and with some departments, it's actually really mature. What I've found really interesting is over the last 7 years that where officers have a really good working relationship, you find that the Centre, in various departments that will remain nameless because others are pretty shocking at it, actually they start to treat combined authority colleagues as colleagues rather than external organisations, and then all of a sudden they can speak to civil servants in quite an open way, confidentially, and kind of say, look, this is the problem we've got, that's the problem we've got, how do we make this work? Whereas I think if it was a traditional local authority, the civil servants would put up the walls and kind of say, well, you're an external organisation, we've got to have these walls in between. Some departments don't do that at all, so if there's anything that government can do about looking at those departments that are more difficult, I would say that. Quickly, I think I was surprised Michael Gove didn't mention it, but maybe because he was a former Secretary of State, but the Department for Education needs a complete shake-up, and I think every single mayor is on the exact same page when it comes to devolution of post-16 skills, something that DFE really needs to get its head around. But ultimately, it comes back, I think, go back to George as well, that comes from the Treasury. And if you want to unlock those types of powers and funding, it's got to be driven either by the Prime Minister's office or the Chancellor's office. And the very final thing around data, I mean, we've now got the ONS located in Darlington, and so built a really good relationship. It's taken us 2 years to get some DWP data out of them, which we've now got. But there's a huge loads of data sets that we're actually shooting in the dark with at the minute, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be shared. A really horrific example of this, and it's nobody's particular fault, but government are trying to get us more involved with kind of remediation of tall buildings, cladding, obviously the whole reform that needs to come along. And we asked the department to share data on the buildings that we have in each of our areas, because the department holds that information. It wasn't just me asking for it, other mayors were asking for it. And my officers were told by an official that we can't because of data protection issues. It's like, so what, we're having to now go out and survey everything and figure out where it all is. So there's really basic things, but that also comes down to treating combined authorities with maturity, that we're all part of the same team really, and there must be a way that the civil service and the combined authorities can almost see each other as colleagues rather than externals. And I think that culturally would be a big step forward rather than legislatively.
Okay, great. So time is against us. There's a couple of questions online I'm going to put to you, and then maybe I'll throw together. Yeah, I saw the lady there. Might be time for one more. I'll put the ones from the online audience, and then we'll take this one all together. So, question from Dan Godley. Mr. Gove mentioned his belief that the mayoral model is not necessarily right everywhere in England. He questioned the need for uniformity. Do the mayors agree? And then we've touched upon fiscal issue in fiscal powers and so on already, but there's a specific question. Do we think mayors can deliver effectively without further fiscal autonomy? So I suppose, yeah, what would you like to see on fiscal devolution or reform in that area? And then, yes, the question from the...
Just Jennifer McKenna from BBC, I just wanted to know what the relationship was like with Sue Gray and whether...
Oh, sorry, do you want to do it again into the mic? My apologies.
Sorry, Jennifer McKenna from the BBC. In terms of your relationship with Sue Gray, was that good? I mean, I hear she was quite good at helping break down those barriers that you were talking about in Whitehall. And has her replacement done enough to help continue to get those barriers broken down?
Okay, interesting question. Yeah, that's probably all we got time for. So, Ben, do you want to go first on those, and then last word to you, Claire?
So on devolution everywhere, I personally think we need devolution everywhere. I do really support actually this government's position of uniformity. I mean, Michael Gove's position of kind of tier 1 to tier 4 deals seemed overly convoluted, really. And I do buy into George Osborne's initial premise, which is if you're going to have devolution, having a directly elected mayor, while people might think that that's not necessary, when you see it in work on the ground, and I'm not just talking about myself, right, I'm talking about all of the mayors, there is an intangible benefit that brings to local democracy, deliverability, the way in which people engage with us. So having that uniformity of have a devolution deal and a mayor, I think is actually really important. I've always been a bit more strident than both Conservative and this Labour government in that I would start to get to a point where you almost kind of start to impose deals, because I think where areas don't have it, they are missing out.
Yeah, that is the plan eventually.
And again, the argument is, OK, well, as people continue to miss out, there's more pressure on them to come together. Is that really the way that we as a government, not political government, but as a government should be managing local authorities, that we're going to allow left behind areas to come to be left behind because for whatever reason local leaders don't want to give up their little fiefdoms? It feels to me a bit wrong. On fiscal devolution, very quickly, I'll let Claire comment more broadly on fiscal devolution, because I know the Labour mayors are in a slightly different place to me. I mean, I remember under the Conservative government they talked about some fiscal devolution, and my argument was it always seems to be a levy on something, so a levy on business rates or council tax, and we've got precepts and we want more flexibility, etc. I was saying to the Treasury, and I said to anybody that would listen to me, OK, well, I'll take those powers, but also if it comes with the counter, which is the ability to reduce taxation on people. It's always a one-way street on more levies and more taxation on people. So I kind of rally quite heavily against fiscal devolution, because actually fiscal devolution in the conversation today is allowing us to tax local people more outside of the central government structures, which I don't think is very fair. And then in the specific question to the BBC about Sue Gray, I had an incredible relationship with Sue Gray, which I thought was slightly bizarre. She was brilliant. From day one, we met with the Prime Minister. I had a private meeting with him because I had not met him before, and it was him and Sue in the room. She was allocated to me, I'm sure, as well as the other mayors, to try and help unpick things. And there were 3 or 4 pretty major issues from an investment perspective that had Sue not really gripped hold of and worked across departments with various secretaries of state, which thankfully all got unpicked, by the way, so thank you very much to Sue Gray, I am absolutely certain would not have happened. So she was brilliant, disappointed to see her go, not had the same engagement in the same way since she went, but actually I've also been pleasantly surprised how, from a political standpoint, this government has engaged with me as the only Conservative around in a really fair and open way. And that's been really positive to see, actually, in general. And hopefully, fingers crossed, that will continue for a little time to come. Great.
OK, Claire, a couple of minutes on those.
I mean, I think it's right to have devolution everywhere and mayors, hopefully, everywhere as well. And I think that if you look at the data, from polling organisations, those people who are in areas with mayors, they actually quite like them. They see the benefits of them. You know, go ask people getting on the B network right now in Manchester what a difference a mayor has made there. So I absolutely agree with the direction of travel of the government. On fiscal devolution, I think what essentially a number of the mayors are keen to see is those powers so that they can make decisions that are right within the area. And, you know, a lot of discussion has focused, for example, on whether or not you could introduce a tourism tax, for example. Not for local people, essentially, but as we see in other European cities, but for tourists to pay. You know, that's not going to be right for many regions because they don't have the tourism economy to support it. But for some, it might be. And I think that's important that, again, if we really truly believe in devolution as a principle, then you make those decisions locally. And then finally, I think it was great in terms of the relationship building that Sue Gray did. But I think where we've got to now is such that we are all building really good relationships with departments and with ministers. And I hope that continues.
Excellent. OK, so that does bring us to the end of the 45 minutes. So thanks so much again, Claire and Ben, for taking the time to speak with us. Next session is starting fairly soon, in 8 minutes, with Darren Jones. So please stick around for that, people in the room and online. So please just join me in thanking our speakers.